Thank you for the invitation and for doing this great work. I also wanted to just say, it seems like we have quite a few people on right now. So we can't certainly go around the room and the virtual room and do introductions or anything. But if folks want to just put kind of where they're from, I assume a lot of you are involved in, adult education, higher education, kind of work study activities and work activities for people who are low income and those kinds of things. But it'd be helpful because I have a lot of slides, I have a lot of data, but I really wanted to kind of pause and have conversation too, throughout and hear from you in terms of what we're talking about today. So that would be great. So again, I'm Renee Koubiadis, the Executive Director of the Anti-Poverty Network of New Jersey, and we've been around for oops, sorry, trying to get to the next slide. There we go. We've been around for over 21 years now as a statewide network of both organizations and individuals. And we seek to prevent, reduce, and end poverty in our state by empowering partners, educating the community, and advocating for solutions together. We do generally, in normal times, have regular meetings throughout the year in person, an annual poverty summit. We do communications work, research with other partners as well, and also work together with our partners to advocate for, real structural solutions and long-term solutions to the issues, the myriad issues and interconnected issues that impact people, and certainly that we've seen, exposed, but also exacerbated in this last year during the pandemic, especially for people of color and women, where there were always those inequities. But just more people are recognizing them during the pandemic. So again, we're a very diverse network of individuals and organizations, and especially always centered in our work is the voice of people who are directly impacted by poverty and homelessness and all these interconnected issues. So just wanted to start with, kind of what poverty is, and what our conception of that is. When I started in this work 5 years ago, or even 4 years ago at APN, the number on the top, which is the federal poverty level for a family of 3, was actually higher than the minimum wage, which is the bottom number, right? And we are one of the many organizations who advocated a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, maybe now, for the $15 minimum wage law, which we're moving towards. So we're finally, I think as of last year, I think it was the first time where the bottom number was higher than the federal poverty level, right? So if you were working full-time year round, which can be a big if for a lot of people too, if they can get that kind of work, you were still under the federal poverty level until a year or two ago with the rising minimum wage now. But even when we passed or were working to pass this law in 2018, we knew then that there was no county in the entire state where anyone could survive, any one individual could survive on less than $17.62 an hour, right? And that was in 2018. We're now in 2021, and we're not getting to $15 an hour until January 1st of 2024. So it's not quite a livable wage, And I think some of our state leaders would, even a year or two later, would say that, if they had known in 2018 what they know now, they would have raised it even higher than 15. So we still, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that too, and kind of the inequality and why it's not just necessarily about more education for economic mobility, but also about some of these structural supports and basic needs too, which I know there's a great focus on in this state in the last couple of years, 2-3 years, especially with the New Jersey Council of Community Colleges or County Colleges, which we've been partnering with on some things as well. Sorry, I must have gone back a slide and didn't realize it while I was talking. So this slide I've been showing for a little while, but it really does, show kind of like, to me, those structural inequities, that it's just not individual fault, it's not somebody made a bad choice, a bad decision, and that's why they're struggling economically. But when you have to the far right on that top, by the age of 60, 79% of people in this country will have experienced economic hardship at some point in their lives. that tells me there are structural issues at play, right? It's not just the individual who's making bad choices or doing things that are not legal or right or whatever, we want to ascribe to that. So we have to break through those myths about people, and understand these structural inequities. You can even see in the bottom, almost half of everyone in this country will receive public assistance at some point by the age of 60. 67% will have been unemployed at some point, and more than half will have lived at or below the federal poverty line, right? And this is from the longest longitudinal study, one of the longest longitudinal studies in the country since 1968. This has been done annually. So another thing we point to in terms of economic inequality is the ALICE report, if folks are familiar with that. So ALICE it stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed, the acronym ALICE. And this report comes from the United Way of Northern New Jersey. They started doing this report in 2007 in Morris County, expanded it to New Jersey shortly after, and now do it for about 20 other states throughout the nation as well to measure the growing inequality that's been happening. And so you can see the blue dots represent the percentage of that population, whatever the category is on this chart, is below the ALICE threshold, and the yellow dots are above. So you can see, certainly for whites, there are a lot more yellow dots than there are blue for people below that below the ALICE threshold, right? But then we look at single female-headed households at the top, and 3 of the 4 blue dots are blue, right? And so the latest report, the latest data they have from 2018, when they released this last year, shows that 73% of single moms in our state are poor and can't meet their basic needs all the time for themselves and their children, right? Not too much greater for single male-headed households. It's over 50%, even though there's only 2 dots there showing 50%. And of course, for Black households, for Hispanic households, for seniors, you see a lot more of those blue dots, showing that, higher percentages of those households. So for seniors, it's 48% of senior households in our state can't meet all their basic needs all the time. 52% of both Black and Hispanic households cannot. And like I said, the single moms is 73%. So this is just another chart, showing some of the same kind of data for, different types of households. So again, all households, 37% of those households are below the ALICE threshold. And when we say 37%, most of them, about 3/4 of them, are working. They're not people who are on cash assistance or other programs and not working, right? So most of these households, so it's almost 2 out of 5 people in our state who are struggling to make basic needs. And this is before the pandemic. We know that the struggles have only exacerbated since then. Sorry, I think I skipped ahead. There we go. So let me just go back. Yeah, so programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs in our nation's history, are great. Head Start is another really great example of an anti-poverty program that really provides, access to the resources that people need to really be lifted out of poverty. And so we need more of that. And certainly some of the policies, especially in the state, have been moving toward expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit. We've raised it since I think the first term of Governor Christie at 25% here in New Jersey for the EITC credit, to 40% this year under Governor Murphy. It's been steadily increasing over the last several years, which is really, really great. And we also just expanded the EITC to people who are under age 25 and not raising children, to be able to apply for this tax. And right now is tax season, so they have until the 17th, which is coming up very, very soon, if folks qualify for that. Sorry. Every time I touch my mouse, things just want to jump around. So, I said earlier, we're talking about economic mobility through adult education, which is really, really needed and great, but it's only part of the solution. We also need wages to keep pace with inflation, especially in our high cost state. So this is a chart, actually comes from data from the US Department of Labor, I apologize, from the earliest point when the US Department of Labor was created and started collecting data of wages and productivity. And so as you can see, from the late 1940s, when they started collecting the data, through the early 70s, those two lines of productivity and hourly compensation for work kept pace with each other, right? And then starting in the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, a lot of different things started changing, especially like policy change towards businesses and corporation, culture, with the incoming CEO, Jack Welch at GE, when GE was a floundering company back in the late 70s, and he came in and turned that company around. Like, culture started changing, where wages were driven down and stagnated for these last several decades. So it's a number of different factors, like I said, federal, state policy, all kinds of different things that really drove wages down. And so now we're just trying to move back towards a place where wages are actually keeping up with the cost of living. But $15 an hour isn't quite getting us there. But if you have two people in the household earning $15 an hour at least, then you are able to kind of better meet your basic needs in that household. And so also during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, we lost many high, mid, and low wage jobs. We were one of the last states to actually fully recover. And I put that in quotations because some people argue that this is not really a full recovery with what I'm going to say now. Sorry, back. Where am I here? That, you know, when we did finally replace more jobs by 2016, even though we lost a lot of mid-wage and high-wage jobs, we mostly replaced them with lower wage jobs, right? And so people are much worse off, than they were prior to 2008 in today's economy in 2021, and certainly during the pandemic, with lost wages and income due to the twin pandemics, if you will. So we really haven't fully recovered, and we've just created more of a low wage job situation for many in our state. And again, we can't just talk about, you know, housing or food assistance or, you know, again, adult education that can lead towards higher wages. We have to talk about all the needs in concert with one another. And that's why the Anti-Poverty Network was founded in 1999, was really to bring organizations and advocates and people together around all of these different issues under the poverty umbrella, because we can't just solve one, like say, give somebody utility assistance, but they're still hungry the next day. We can't give somebody food, but they still worry about paying their rent or their mortgage next week or next month. And you can't give somebody housing assistance, but the wages that they're earning in their job are too low to maintain that housing on a long-term basis, and they're eventually going to be housing insecure or homeless again, right? So we have to talk about all these things together, sorry. And then we also have to go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If a student is, not housing secure, whether they're sleeping in a car, in a park, sleeping even on, a relative or a friend's sofa, moving around from place to place because they don't have a home of their own, that very basic level of sleep and homeostasis, right? And access to constant food and water and what we need to survive at that very basic level of Maslow's hierarchy. When they're not met, we can't focus in a classroom. We can't focus on building skills for employment, and all those kinds of things. So we can't expect people to, be as present and do as well as they could, when they don't have all of their basic needs met to begin with. They can't move on to those other levels of safety and employment and resources and family and health and friendship and, what every human being needs which is connection to other human beings too, right? And those higher levels of self-esteem, confidence, and achievement and respect as well. So we did a report in 2016 with the Thomas Edison State University's John Watson Public Policy Institute called The Cost of Poverty. And it really showed how New Jersey is one of the most segregated states in the nation, and that we have areas in every single of our 21 counties in this state, you know, municipalities that are big and small and medium size in every county. They generally have inadequate, substandard, and unaffordable housing. They have a limited tax base and other resources to deal with this great concentration of poverty and people of color. They typically have strained schools, limited access to jobs and transportation a lot of times. And then more of these environmental toxins are placed in these communities, right? And so what's happened over time is that you might have neighboring municipalities where one has become more an area of more concentrations of poverty and people of color and segregation. And they've lost, you know, some of the corporations, bigger businesses that were paying taxes in the past over the last few decades over time, and they've moved to some of the other neighboring areas. So they are the strained areas with this concentration of need and less funding to deal with that need. And you might have a neighboring municipality right next door that has that you know, tax base, and the companies there paying more taxes, but they don't have the need anymore, right? So they have more resources, and they don't have to deal with the homelessness that they move to another municipality because they give somebody a bus ticket to go to the nearest shelter, wherever that was, in the neighboring municipality, right? And so we, through, you know, a lot of different reasons, we've concentrated poverty and we've really segregated people in our state everywhere, in every county, over the decades as well. And so we did a second report in 2017 called The Uncomfortable Truth, Racism, Injustice, and Poverty in New Jersey. And I won't go into it too much, but just to say that, you know, in order to do the work, and this was a more than 2-year process of really wonderfully diverse, you know, experts and advocates who came together to really have these thoughtful conversations over this period of time to really identify all of the different issues around 6 broad policy areas of structural racism and systemic poverty in our state, and to develop over 100 policy solutions for how our state can move beyond those 2 issues. And we've accomplished some of those in the last few years, but we really need this definition for our own selves to really guide our work too, so that we had a common understanding of what we were talking about and what we wanted to do. And so structural racism is not intentional preferential treatment of one group over another, not prejudice or expressions of overt racism, individual racism, but it is disparate access to opportunity that's embedded in all of our social structures and all of our systems, and the result of both historical conscious, so intentional, and unintentional policies, decisions, and programs. And so, and certainly for people of color, it's, you know, what you all see constantly and all the time throughout your lives. But for mostly white people, it's not something that we see unless we really stop to look at, why do we do this certain thing or have this certain guideline for a program to serve people? You know, like, unless we stop, really look at those things and analyze them, do we recognize the inherent racism in those things that we do all the time. It's just the way we've always done things, but we really need to stop and have that kind of analysis to really undo the harms that we're doing to people. So this comes from, you know, Prosperity Now and New Jersey Institute for Social Justice that we work with. And basically, you know, the headline at the top, if you can see the whole thing, says US has a racial wealth gap problem, but New Jersey has a disaster, right? So on the left, you can see that throughout the country, for white households, the average wealth is 171,000, but obviously much less for Latino and Black households at 20,700 and 17,600. But if you look at the right in New Jersey, it's even greater, that disparity, right? I mean, 352,000, the average white wealth, and only 7,300 for Latino households and 6,100 for Black households in terms of accumulated wealth, right? And there are many reasons for that. But we know that home ownership is one of the biggest sources of wealth building in our country, and always has been. But we have denied, if you read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law from 2017, he really lays out very well how our segregation is not just what they call de facto segregation, it's commonly referred to in that legal term, which means it's just kind of how people moved around and settled, and the patterns that developed just from happenstance, but it is in fact de jure segregation. Again, going back to what I said a moment ago on the last slide about intentional policies, right? So we always laud the New Deal under FDR of putting in place a lot of really great programs that helped a lot of people coming out of the Great Depression. However, the major housing program that provided funding for families to buy homes as part of the New Deal, specifically in its policy denied that funding to Black households, right? And so it's not just that white households started buying homes back then and were able to gain that access to that wealth building feature, but then those homes accumulated wealth over time, over these decades. And as those homes and that money, if the home was sold, was passed on from generation to generation, the wealth of white families grew. And for many, many decades now since then, that opportunity has been denied to most families of color, right? Because of those kinds of policies.
So Renee, I think it's worth pointing out here, there's a question here from Catherine about the numbers, and Jane, I think we're starting to answer this a little bit, the difference between wealth and income, right? And I think you're starting to point that out, that some wealth comes from home ownership,
right,
but other wealth comes from things like retirement funds that you have, right?
Absolutely.
Or investment funds that you have. So it's
right,
not just income, right? But it's the wide range of wealth that we may pick up.
Right. It's all those kinds of things. And so as we were talking about earlier, those low wage jobs and how more and more low wage jobs are now created in our state after the Great Recession. Those are primarily held by people of color and women, right? And so that's, again, like you're saying, a source of that lack of wealth. And another thing that we've been working on more recently, and unfortunately the legislation has been moving, but I believe that they're going to hold it until lame duck later this year to fully pass potentially. But it's an issue that's, a lot of people didn't even realize, even though Consumer Reports and the Consumer Federation of America and others have been doing this work and trying to expose this issue for 20 years or so now, is auto insurance rates. So in New Jersey, auto insurers can use your education, your occupation, your marital status, and all of these socioeconomic indicators to set your rates, right? Instead of relying on your driving record. And so their studies actually show that someone in a low wage job, who's a person of color, maybe with a high school education, pays almost 3 times as much sometimes as a doctor or lawyer who has a terrible driving record in auto insurance, right? And I'll give a quick example. The board president of APN is a Latino woman with a high school education, but she has held many different leadership roles in our state and is just an extremely, knowledgeable and excellent advocate on so many different issues, especially around criminal justice. And when she found this out, when she got involved in this legislative campaign last fall, it was the same week she was up for renewal under her insurance carrier for 20 years she had, right? And she said, okay, well, let me just, figure out and try a couple different places to compare rates while I'm trying to renew. She was paying $2,000 more under the 20-year, insurance company she was with than she was with somebody like Cure, who doesn't use these socioeconomic indicators to set auto insurance rates, right? And so over 20 years, if you think about, all of that money, it could have been like $20,000, $40,000 extra she was spending on auto insurance over that time. She's still living in an apartment. She could have been a homeowner by now. She could have been saving for her retirement, right? I mean, so that's the other ways that we're denying wealth to families of color in those ways too. So thanks for bringing that up.
People often refer to as like the high cost of being poor.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I call it the poverty tax.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think this is also,
Or poor people's tax.
yeah, I think this is also a perfect example of where anti-poverty work and adult education can come together, right? Because looking at those statistics are a perfect activity for a numeracy class, right? Or a literacy class or an ESL class, right? So being able to compare the statistics and analyze them and interpret them is the exact type of thing that we need to be doing in adult ed classes.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a couple more slides in terms of like that structural inequality, but I'd rather pause here and see if there are any other kinds of points or you know, comments or questions around that and some of the interconnections between adult education and some of these factors that we're talking about, if anybody wants to.
Oh, can you go back one more slide, Renee?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Sure. I mean, the other thing too here, right, this is perfect for a lesson, which is not only is the proportion or is the ratio in New Jersey worse, but the raw numbers for Black and Latino families are also worse, right? In terms of their level of wealth, right? So we just had the session before yours was about problem posing and interactive activities in math class, right? And I think this would be a perfect one, right? We're like, let's take a look at this bar graph and what are some things that we can learn from looking at the structure and the data in this bar graph.
Right, right. Yeah. And just, you know, just the sheer stress of constantly trying to deal with all of these issues and juggle too little income on all these different things too, can play a toll, it can have a toll on someone's health, on their mental health, on their ability to pay attention in class and do work. And you know, I've heard of you know, professors saying like, well, there was somebody falling asleep in class, but you know, until you stop and ask, you know, what's going on in that person's life, you don't realize that they're constantly like they're moving from house to house, or you know, or they're constantly working or taking care of siblings because their parents are, you know, not able to, and you know, all these different things, right? So that's why I love the work that New Jersey Council of Community Colleges and all the community colleges are doing around the state to try and really connect all of these issues and connect within each of the counties, you know, where these colleges are, to the nonprofits and community organizations and supports across the state to really uncover like what are the things that we can change in simple policy. Like a couple of years ago, we got the SNAP administrative change at the state level under Department of Human Services to say that certain you know, vocational educational courses at community colleges now count towards work activities for SNAP food assistance, right? So just those kinds of simple changes of really coming together and talking about these issues together to solve them so that people can be more successful and move forward and not have these barriers in their way. So any other, you know, thoughts about that? Any questions? Let's see if there's anything in the chat.
People were just saying how the numbers are making them sad.
Yeah. So I don't want to leave on a sad note because there's a lot of great stuff happening too. Sorry.
No, but I think it's important that if you're sad and your students are sad, self-care is also important, right?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
we're addressing these emotions, addressing this anxiety is crucial.
Right. And I'm a social worker. I have an undergraduate and master's degree in social work. And so that's a big part of our profession is self-care, you know, always. And I always talk to master's level students every year at Rutgers and talk about that idea of self-care. And that could be anything. That could be, you know, hanging out with family and friends, although it's been a little difficult in the last year, but reading a book, going for a bike ride, like, you know, doing yoga, meditation, whatever it is for you, that is self-care. It doesn't have to be a certain defined thing, self-care, right? So whatever that means for you to kind of de-stress and, you know, kind of take a breath. So I just wanted to point out a couple of these slides in terms of the segregation and racial, you know, kind of inequities too. This comes from Steve Sterling, who's no longer a reporter here in New Jersey, but it was a few years ago he put these slides together that really kind of harken back to the redlining maps for housing and mortgage and loan industries in the 30s and 40s that has been outlawed, but the history kind of still permeates through some of our policies from the federal down to the local level, unfortunately. And so we can see, the blue represents white households, purple is Hispanic, and orange is Black. And so you can see these clear areas of segregation, right? That, we have that de facto segregation, as Richard Rothstein said in his book, The Color of Law, that it's created by our structures, our policies, our laws, right? It's intentional at some point, even though we may be trying to dismantle that now. And then you can compare that to the redlining map of Essex County, from the 30s, and you can see that same kind of clear delineation of where white households were living and where families of color were living. And certainly the redlining term comes from that red part of the map where no home loans were given to, houses in those areas because they were considered hazardous and declining communities because people of color were there. And then here is also Passaic County, parts of Passaic County as well, where you can see again those clear areas of segregation and places where there are less opportunities and barriers and less quality education, less access to transportation. You might have to take 2 or 3 buses to get somewhere or to a good job, right? Like all those kinds of things that exist throughout our state that create those barriers for people to get ahead. Sorry, there we go. And then just to tie that back to, education, this is from a couple of years ago with the New Jersey Council of County Colleges Building Pathways to New Jersey's Future report, right? So you can see what they saw at the state level, in post-secondary education, certainly not super high numbers, and certainly, especially when you get to graduate or professional degree level, but certainly, short-term credentials and other things are key to us moving forward and creating more economic mobility for people too. So part of this statewide plan, along with the New Jersey Council of County Colleges and other departments in the state, is to create these supports and also create the career pathways that really help people to move forward, like apprenticeships within the county colleges, work-study internships, right? Among these other kinds of options to really help people gain the skills for economic mobility. And then of course, on the right, you can see, the educational attainment by race and ethnicity, and certainly much higher for white households or white people and Asian and Pacific Islanders compared to African American, Native American, and Hispanics in our state. And so their goal is really to get to 65% of our population, our adult population, having a 2-year degree by the year 2025, which we're getting closer to. And again, this includes partnerships between the New Jersey Council of County Colleges, the county colleges themselves, and nonprofits, community partners to really kind of identify the supports that are already out there and places where we can make adjustments and undo the structures that are creating harm rather than supporting people, so that people's basic needs can be met and they can really attain these levels of education or at least skill development and to get into career pathways that they don't just, move out of a job and it's a dead-end job and they don't really move anywhere, right? And there's not an opportunity to keep building. So some of the solutions that we've been working on at the Anti-Poverty Network of New Jersey since about 2018 with our partner at Work New Jersey Policy Perspective, which is a statewide think tank, we started convening a work group in summer of 2018 and fleshing this kind of blueprint for the state with many different stakeholders that intersect at the Work First New Jersey program in different places, which includes TANF, which is Temporary Assistance in Needy Families, and General Assistance, which is the cash assistance for individuals, right? And so we've identified about 20 different reforms that need to happen to really, when people fall into deep poverty and get caught in this program, that they're really getting the supports and help they need to be lifted out of poverty and not just pushed out into the first available job, even if it's just part-time, doesn't pay a livable wage, or isn't sustainable long-term because of transportation or other issues, right? And then they fall back into the same situation. So improving, expanding education and training. So that includes some of the things I just mentioned, right? And making sure, and Department of Labor a couple of years ago, when we were developing this, said to us that they really want to make sure that people are moving beyond this program into work activities that, get them into at least a $15 minimum wage job, right? And don't just push them out the door to the first available thing. And allow work activities with for-profit. So some people may not know, but when our new TANF system was set up after welfare reform passed in 96 at the federal level, and we set up our program here in 97 to mirror that, that we defined work activities as only things that can be done with nonprofits. And there are so many different industries across the state who have been screaming at the state since before Governor Murphy took office, saying that we don't have enough qualified people for jobs. We can't fill our jobs, right? In a lot of different industries where there is growth, where there is, pay that would lift them out of poverty, right? But we're denying everybody in this program access to those kinds of activities to get into jobs, right? And so we need to change that law, and we need to allow for those work activities to be done with for-profit industries and workplaces as well. We've already decreased the work requirement hours to match the federal requirements. Again, career pathways opportunities, increased child support pass-through amount. So that actually is happening, most likely in the governor's budget proposal for the fiscal year starting July 1st, has proposed 3 of our reform measures, including the child support increase. So that will happen, as well as intensive case management for people who have more intense long-term complex needs, right? That they're doing that more intensive case management to help those parents move forward and address their needs, earlier, much earlier in the process, because there's a 5-year lifetime limit in the program. And normally they weren't doing it until year 4 of the 5 with this intensive case management piece. So they have to do it a year or 2 earlier to really address people's needs and help them move where they need to get to. And then also keeping the case open for a little bit longer when parents are in sanction status, if they've not met, documentation requirements for your recertification or any of those kinds of things, and they've been sanctioned, that the case remains open for up to 6 months so that the parents can really get back into compliance and not be cut off and then be worse off as well. And then, of course, mandate data collection by Department of Human Services and Department of Labor and Workforce Development, which would be in this larger piece of legislation, which actually passed last year, but was vetoed by Governor Murphy because of the pandemic and the fiscal crisis the state was facing at the time. But we're working with them, hopefully in the next year or so, to pass more of these reform measures. But really, so that DHS and Department of Labor are taking a look at, which they're not currently doing and haven't done in the past, like when people come off this program and are getting into community college or apprenticeship programs and other kinds of work activities to move beyond, what is their wage? How long are they able to maintain that employment? All those kinds of measures. So we're actually seeing that there's success, that we're, helping people to move forward.
Renee, there's a question from
Yeah.
Lorraine, which is that if in the reforms that there'll be a mental health component, because
Yeah.
students
So
have that as a clear need as well.
that actually is part of the intensive case management that I mentioned earlier. It's called SAI, sorry. And so it's generally for people with mental health issues, with addictions issues, with those, kind of more deep rooted, like I said, complex long-term issues, is what that intensive case management is intended for. And certainly, there are more of those kinds of measures moving forward in legislation and other policies. We're seeing even during the last year coming out of this pandemic in terms of providing more mental health supports and services to people. And it's been a huge need during the pandemic. I mean, I know folks who had issues before or had issues years past, and now they resurfaced, right? And it was so hard to even find a provider, in our state during this last year.
So, and an earlier question Lorraine had is about kind of strategies for the students. And what I would suggest, Lorraine and everybody else, is I think one of the reasons that this kind of information is really important is that these are problems that we can't solve individually, right? And so it's working together on campaigns like this that we can actually make a change. So I think this
Yeah.
type of information is helpful for both teachers, but also for students who want to get involved in the fight for these issues.
Yeah, yeah. And somebody was also saying not everybody in these programs has intense mental issues,
Right.
right? They could just be, kind of complex issues, just meeting all of these different kinds of basic needs, or, disabilities of a family member, or, all kinds of different things that create these complex, interconnected situations where it's harder to climb out of poverty. And somebody, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to go up to, I can't seem to scroll up here on my screen for the
Lynn
chat.
had a question
Somebody asked me
about,
about universal basic income, but I can't see the question.
so Lynn wanted to know where you stood on the idea of a minimum guaranteed income.
Yeah, yeah,
In Newark. And what I had
right,
commented to Lynn was that from what I've seen, minimum income has been helpful everywhere they tried it,
right.
especially if it's not a replacement for the social safety net, right?
Exactly, exactly. And that's exactly where we stand. And even before this really became more of an, a positive, kind of movement in the last few years in our country. At our last full poverty summit in person at the end of 2019, before the pandemic, we had a workshop with one of the national experts who's been working on these projects of universal basic income. Her name's Amy Castro Baker, and she's a professor of social work at University of Pennsylvania. And she worked on the Stockton, California project, which is showing amazing results, was on the steering committee for that. And also has worked in Jersey City, and now this Newark project. And I actually just emailed her earlier this week about something. She's doing some great research at UPenn that's collaborating with all these different great projects, because we definitely, as you said, Eric, need to make sure that if we're implementing universal basic income in these pilot projects around the country and hopefully around the state, that it's not replacing or taking monies away from these other supported programs, right? If we have nearly 2 out of 5 people in our state unable to meet basic needs all the time, even though they or their parents are working, that shows that whatever supports there are already, it's just a barest minimum of a safety net, and it's not enough really to help people. And so we need this universal basic income, this little bit of extra cash on top of that, to really help people to get ahead, right? And so whether it's a few $100s, $1,000 here or there, those things are needed, because that's why the Earned Income Tax Credit program, I said, is one of the most successful federal programs ever that helps lift people out of poverty every year. And why it is because people get that, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, whatever it is at the tax season, back in the taxes they paid, the income taxes, and they're able to then pay for the car repairs they've been holding off on, and just hoping and praying that their car didn't die and they didn't lose their job, right? Or pay for the glasses for their child, or buy the school supplies that they couldn't at the beginning of the school year for their kids, right? Like all these different things that we don't think about, because when we're talking about basic needs, we're again just talking about those very basics of housing, food, right? Transportation, childcare, healthcare. We're not talking about going out to dinners, or buying luxury items, or even being able to afford cleaning supplies or toiletries, or again those school supplies for your kids, or clothes for kids. None of that is included in those basics. And so we really need to kind of look at those kinds of proposals like universal basic income to help supplement and expand the earned income tax credit and all of those kinds of things, to really give people access to the income that they've been denied because of that wage stagnation since the early 70s that I talked about earlier, right? We're not getting the income in our society in general that we should be. So a colleague of mine, I'll just say this really quickly, a couple of years ago had, she's also runs a statewide organization, nonprofit, and had, I think, one of her board members come to her and say, well, there's this woman who has 2 or 3 children, I forget, coming to us asking us for assistance. And this board member was saying, well, why should we help her? She made her own choices. She had those children as a single mom. It's her own fault, right? Going back to that blaming the victim. And she smartly said, well, I don't know about her situation because I've never been a single mom. But what I can tell you is when I was growing up decades ago, my father was the only one who worked in our house. My mom never worked outside the home. We always had enough for our 3 kids and the family and our family. And even when my dad got laid off for a while, for about a year or something, we had enough in savings to get through that period until he got a job again, right? And that's no longer possible. When you see that 73% of single moms don't have an income to meet their basic needs all the time for themselves and their family, and at least 50% of single dads, even, you can't survive on a single salary anymore like you could in the past. So obviously there are structural issues that have changed over the last few decades, right? So, and then these are just some of the other things that we advocate for at the Anti-Poverty Network to really kind of create some of that structural change. And some of these come from, I think all of these maybe come from our 2017 Uncomfortable Truth report about structural racism and systemic poverty. We used to have a public advocate that was created by Governor Byrne in '74 and abolished in '94 by Governor Whitman. It was recreated in 2005 under Governor Corzine and abolished by Governor Christie in his first year in office. And this was something Governor Byrne, when he created this office, was a voice for the voiceless and government under glass. So it really examined the issues within our systems and our structures. And so it could take like a complaint from a person or a family about the harms that are befalling them because of a program and the guidelines, and kind of see that from multiple people and families and elevate that to like, we need to change this. It's not just this one person or this one family, right? And so we need something like that. Again, we're advocating for that this year. Governor Murphy actually signed our poverty solutions pledge in 2017, was it? When he was running for the primary election, stating that he would recreate this office. We also, sorry, I get back there. Got racial ethnic impact statements required for criminal justice legislation right before Governor Christie left office. He signed this into law, but we also need that lens on all state legislation for every single issue going forward to really identify and have an assessment of whether this new policy is going to have a disparate impact on groups or groups of, racial or ethnic groups. Community schools, which is a really great idea that's growing across the state to really give that foundation to people, because I think a lot of what we need to look at in identifying these structural changes is we would save so much money as a state if we identified and provided the supports to people and families earlier on before they got involved in the criminal justice system, before they had these huge health or mental health issues or addiction issues, right? Like before these larger problems get created and they get funneled into these systems that further and further harm, especially families of color, right? And we've seen great expansion of healthcare access and subsidies, but we certainly need more of that. We just had our state-owned, state-run exchange up and operational in this last year, and we see these new subsidies coming through the federal stimulus packages too now to help provide more subsidies and healthcare to people. And that's a huge cost as well. If we could just provide a little more support, it would free up monies for other things that the family needs to spend on, right? And harm reduction for drug treatment and addressing needs for aging out foster care youth and criminal justice reform. And I'm happy to report the Earn Your Way Out. I don't know if you can see this with the logo on the bottom, but Earn Your Way Out was something that Senator Lesniak was pushing before he left office and finally got passed into law after he left. But it really provides true rehabilitation while people are in our county or state jails, right? And provides them with training and education, kind of college courses and supports, to really get their life back and put their life back together, then rather than putting them out and harming them through policies of the GA ban, which is the one right before that on this screen. So this policy has been in place since the 90s, unfortunately, and it prevents people from who have drug distribution convictions from receiving general assistance or emergency assistance, right? It's the only criminal offense that you are denied this kind of assistance in our state. You could commit murder or rape and still get this assistance. But if you've sold drugs at some point to survive, you are denied from getting the assistance if you find yourself homeless. And so we need to finally remove this ban. It was passed twice under Governor Christie and vetoed both times. Governor Murphy has now put the money into his budget proposal for this year to eliminate this. And I've been working actually on over the last 24 hours feverishly to make sure the trajectory is still moving forward on this legislation. It's now sponsored on the Senate side by Senate President Sweeney. So it has strong support, in addition to the governor putting money forward. And it is up for a hearing on Tuesday morning. It was supposed to be Monday, now it's been moved to Tuesday morning to pass in the Assembly Committee. And so we're very, very hopeful that this will finally be eliminated, this ban, by June in this state. So we are moving forward. So again, I don't want to leave people with a, kind of the sadness and, all that, but just wanted to kind of open it up for questions again, too, with a few minutes left or comments.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Renee. So I know some of you have to run to like other classes and stuff, so I put the PD certificate link in there. I mean, Renee, one of the things that I'm just becoming more aware of recently is the outcomes for people who have been in the foster care system and how longitudinal the impact is on them in terms of overrepresentation in criminal justice system, underrepresented in higher education achievement. And I feel like they're written off, right? Once they're 18 and they're grown-ups, it's like you have to take care of yourself and not really thinking about what the impact was, and they're in the foster system, not through anything that they chose or anything that they did, but that's an experience that somebody can encounter that's going to have lifelong impact on them.
Absolutely. And just kind of the mental and emotional harms that they may have experienced in their life as well, just as a result of being involved in that system again. Sorry, let me go back. I actually worked in child welfare when it was DIFUS a number of years ago for almost 3 years. So I definitely understand this. And thankfully, there are some policies that have been put in place in the last few years. So under Governor Christie, the long-term DCF Commissioner, Allison Blake, who I know personally, made sure there was research to look at the issue of housing for stability with families so that children weren't removed from households to begin with. And then we were able to put in place the Keeping Families Together housing voucher program for the neediest families in I think it was 5 counties initially as a pilot, and then that got expanded to every single county now. And more the state's prioritizing monies to put into those kinds of voucher programs to really recognize those deep issues. If we could just provide those supports again up front, we don't then create those longer term issues for the children as adults, right?
Spend $500 to keep a family in their house and intact,
yeah,
as opposed to countless thousands of dollars down the road.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know there's still a ways to go, in some of the reforms that we've been working on for probably 30 years now in the child welfare system. But some of those things are starting to happen, which is nice to see, and hopefully more and more of that will happen. We have a really great commissioner who came in under Governor Murphy as well, Christine Norbert Beyer, I believe, who's really kind of bringing stakeholders together, including families who are impacted and people who've grown up in foster care to really inform their decisions and their policies going forward. So that's why I say it's slow, but things are changing, which is good to see. And I also just wanted to comment because I saw somebody talk about just kind of the mindset of generational poverty, and I wanted to talk about that for a moment. So we actually, I helped create a program called Garden State Leaders, and I apologize if you can't see the title at the top, but we are beginning our 7th cohort actually in late June or July. But we've rotated this program around to different universities and community colleges actually around the state since about 2015. And it's a free program for people who've been impacted by poverty or homelessness or both. And it's usually a 6-month program in person, but we reduced it to 4 months in our virtual program last year. You know, what we see is just by treating people with dignity and respect from day one in this program, helping them bond together to really understand the structural inequities and to begin to recognize that it's not their fault, even though that's the message they've always received about their situation and any kind of assistance they've ever sought to address their situation, their economic situation, right? Then helps them to begin that mindset shift, right? And I talk about it as if, like, you know, and I grew up in poverty myself on welfare in Camden County. You know, you're just in survival mode, moving from one crisis to the next, whether it's daily or weekly or monthly, you know, and you're just constantly stressed. And then you can't even think long term because you're just constantly worried about that next thing, right? Or that next thing happens and then you're in crisis again. And so that you can't really move beyond and see those opportunities for yourself. And so just quickly, I know we're almost out of time here. You know, we brought together the first 2 cohorts in 2016 after the 2015 and 2016 cohorts completed for celebration. And we just went around the room and asked people to share kind of like, just what have you been doing since you completed the program? And we were amazed at person after person who said, I had a couple of 2 or 3 part-time jobs. I now got a full-time job with benefits. I didn't have a job. Now I have a job. I had a job. Now they see my leadership ability and I got this huge promotion in my organization. Or people who were just really like have entrenched structural issues too, and barriers, who maybe didn't get a job yet, but they were already pursuing other kinds of training opportunities for themselves to get where they needed to be, because they now saw those opportunities for themselves and they didn't see them before, right? And so things like that really just kind of help. And it doesn't have to be our program, you know, there are lots of different kinds of things out there and different programs like this, you know, that really help give people back a little of that dignity and worth that they should automatically have by being born in this world. And help them to begin that shift in their thinking and to value themselves and to see those opportunities for themselves and pursue them.
Yeah. I mean, as I think the point that you had made earlier about, you know, it used to be the case that a single earner in a family would be enough to support that family. You know, my parents got divorced when I was in middle school, lived with my mom, who was a working mom. Not enough, right? We needed government assistance. We got,
Right.
I got government cheese, I got government peanut butter, I got government stuff, I got reduced lunch at school.
Yeah.
My mom was working full time, right?
Right.
And so it wasn't a question that like she, you know, any choices that she made, generation before that, she could have raised us on her salary, but it was not enough. There's a question from Karen about the Garden State Leaders Program.
Yes. So we're actually about to open up our application process for this next cohort, which will again be virtual for probably like July through October-ish. So it can be anyone from anywhere in the state who participates, because we're doing it virtually. And you can find information, I would say, go to well, is there a way to put it in the chat maybe?
Yeah, if you can tell me. Yeah. So www.
Yeah, let me just write it down here if I can. So our partner, I actually was on the board of the New Jersey Coalition to End Homelessness for a few years, and we started that program through the coalition. And then the next year, right before I came to APN, my predecessor wanted to partner on the program. So it's now a joint program between the Anti-Poverty Network and the Coalition to End Homelessness. But I only give you their website. We do have it on our website as well, because next Thursday, we're making a big news announcement about the future of the Anti-Poverty Network. So I want to direct you to their website for now.